Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello friends, we are continuing with our previous lecture where we were discussing subaltern studies intervention in Indian history writing. We had talked about core arguments, and to recapitulate that, they have argued that the entire historiography on Indian national movement has been elitist and bourgeois in nature. Then they have argued that there are two parallel domains of politics. One where the elite leaders and state operates. At another level, there is a domain where subaltern groups of society such as peasants, workers, intermediate groups in towns and country, they not merely participate, but they dominate. The third argument which follows is that in this parallel domain of politics, peasants or subalterns participate in terms of their own consciousness. The fourth core argument is that this arena of politics is autonomous to the other arena, autonomous but not isolated. This is autonomous in the sense that it does not either emanate from or depend upon the another arena of politics. And because of these two arenas and the entire focus of these scholarship on the second arena, which is the domain of the subalterns, we come across a very diverse field of politics with huge potential to challenge and offer insights into not merely how and why people participate in national movement, but also how the idiom of their participation, the grammar of this politics can provide immense insight and understanding of the very nature of politics itself at the ground level, the manner in which politics is being practiced. With these core arguments, let us have a look of some of the key contributions, and then we will also examine the challenges and their contributions both at the level of methodological terrain as well as in terms of their engagement with sources and their marshalling of other disciplinary practices while writing history of the subcontinent. We briefly talked about the first volume of Subaltern Studies, collection of essay which came in 1982. This was followed by a full length study of peasant insurgencies in colonial period, and this was written by Ranajit Guha. The core figure around which this school of historiography has come into being. And in this book, he has systematically revisited the instances and historiography on peasants and tribal insurgencies, which dotted the map of India from 18th and 19th century onwards, and he has refuted number of claims put forwarded by earlier historians. For example, he has convincingly demonstrated that unlike other historians who argued that these tribal insurgencies were spontaneous in nature, they lacked any organizational skill and so on and so forth, lacked any vision. He had shown, contrary to these historians, that these insurgencies were neither spontaneous nor lacked a plan for the future. This has substantially advanced our understanding of the category of political itself, which will come to attend slightly later. Another crucial signpost in this group is study of working class consciousness in the context of jute mills by Deepesh Chakrabarty, and Deepesh has carefully offered us a scenario where culture plays extremely crucial role. In fact, culture shapes the working class consciousness. In this context of jute mills, he has argued that the working class consciousness was crucially shaped by the social and cultural ties of these workers, their contractors, coming from the region of eastern UP, western Bihar. Hence, through this study, the wider point we draw is that we have to pay attention to local forces, local context in which relationship between capital and labor gets materialized, instead of merely articulating this history in universal and given terms. Shahid Amin, on the other hand, takes us to the regional colonial archives, record rooms, to show us how the figure of Mahatma Gandhi was perceived and was circulated among the masses, among subalterns far away from the glittering politics of Delhi and far away from the boardroom of Congress policy making bodies. And there through a very close reading of myths and rumors reported in newspapers and different kinds of documents, Amin offers us an extremely plural and messy terrain of popular politics, of subaltern consciousness, which was obviously not isolated, because what was getting circulated was the figure of Mahatma himself, but this was an autonomous certainly, as the figure of Gandhi and his politics, his ideologies, his preachings, all were circulated in varieties of ways, and many of these certainly did not conform to Mahatma's own philosophy. So, there is a clear disjuncture that we come across in the way in which people perceived Mahatma Gandhi and what Mahatma Gandhi wanted people to perceive and to act. Later on, Syed Amin came up with a monograph on a very crucial event, Chauri Chaura, which took place in 1922, when a local police thana was burned down. In this monograph on Chauri Chaura, when in 1922 a local police thana was burned down by a group of angry villagers, Syed Amin revisits and offers us a layered, thickly layered account in which myths, memories and event all get enmeshed into each other. A fine illustration of historical fieldwork. The book immediately acquired the status of a classic in history writing on modern India. He has shown us, and we also know that Mahatma Gandhi, soon after the incidents, distanced himself, critiqued the violence of the event, condemned it in unequivocal terms, and withdrawn his proposed non-cooperation Khilafat movement. People who were arrested for burning the Thana acquired the status of criminal not merely in colonial police records, but also in the nationalist circuits. It was only after nearly 50 years that Government of India in 1971 recognized them as martyrs. Shahid Amin unearths local stories, myths about this burning of Thana, where the local narratives and ground realities emerge in terms of customs, belief patterns, and smaller details, the idiom, the language, the attire, the figure of the volunteers, who were called Otiyas. All these come together in his historical craftsmanship to tell a history which is simultaneously immensely local and a tale that nation had forgotten, or to put it correctly perhaps, the nation, a tale that nation chose to forget as they distanced themselves from these martyrs and their families for a long period of time. This is an example of peasant mentality or peasant culture in broader sense of the term, and its coming together with nationalist politics. On the other hand, we have contributions from Partha Chatterjee, and his engagement with the question of nation and nationalism, though his initial work was on land question in Bengal, but his intervention in the discourse on nation and nationalism has offered us perhaps the most influential critique coming from non-Western traditions, non-Western scholarship, and he unsettles the normative Western model of looking at nation and nationalism. To explain this contribution, let me briefly take a detour, and if you recall, in our previous lecture we had argued that in Marxist historiography, in Marxist frame, nation is considered as a historical construct which came into being in human society at one crucial juncture. This was 16th century Europe. Working under this broad framework of Marxism, Benedict Anderson, a leading scholar on the question of nation and nationalism, argued that nation is an imagined community. It is an imagined, not in sense that it is true or false, but it's imagined as a community of people who may not be directly connected to each other in terms of their life activities and in terms of their thinking. Benedict Anderson has argued that nation is an imagined community, while he subscribes to the wider Marxist formulation that nation comes into being at a specific historical milieu. But he says that, and in that sense it is a construct rather than a primordial unit. Benedict Anderson says that all communities larger than the immediate communities which are larger than those where people interact and where this interaction can be observed empirically. Communities larger than this are imagined communities which take shape in the imagination, which may not, which is beyond the truth and false claims, and it is this supra community of individuals which we come to associate with nation. This nation, when first emerged in Western European context, soon acquired a modular form, and it is in this modular form it got spread in colonies in non-Western world. So, for non-Western societies, for colonies, what was left was to merely follow and imitate the grammar of nationalism, the tapestry of consciousness, which was already framed and frozen in Western European context. Partha Chatterjee has rejected this idea and has shown that in Indian context, the grammar, the language, the politics of nationalism was articulated not by imitating this Western model, but by maintaining a distance from it and through an articulation of difference with this Western model of nationalism. Another crucial intervention of Partha Chatterjee in this regard has been on the terrain, on the conceptualization of time itself, where he argues, again contesting Benedict Anderson's formulation. Partha Chatterjee argues that nation exists in heterogeneous time, and this is important because Anderson had argued that, following another key intellectual, Walter Benjamin's idea of capital's time, time of the capital, which Benjamin had argued that capital exists and functions in homogeneous empty time. Anderson borrows this from Benjamin and argues that nation functions in empty homogeneous time. This is a time in which people who may be separated from each other in their everyday life in terms of their interactions, but come to imagine and come to extend a solidarity with each other, and a we feeling emerges when they come across newspaper reportings and other such artifacts. It is this print capitalism which generates the possibility of giving rise to this solidarity, but this exists not in real time, but in homogeneous empty time. Partha Chatterjee, on the other hand, has contested this and has convincingly argued that the entire process, the terrain itself, the conceptualization of time itself in Indian context does not acquire an emptiness. It is heterogeneous, thoroughly imbued with different understandings and notions, where one strand may not follow the other in a similar manner. So, to imagine that there is a time scale on which we should judge society, there is an imagined time scale which capital wants us to believe, where capital places the developed West, the industrial West, the capitalist West at one location, and rest of the colonies striving for that location is itself erroneous. It is not that Britain's past or capitalist past is India's present. It is erroneous to think that what is West today, India will become, or Indian society will become tomorrow, because thinking like that automatically places cultures and civilizations in single hierarchical relationship, and thereby eliminating the possibilities of cultural specificities and uniqueness of each social formation to articulate and voice their own politics. The another crucial contribution comes from historians like Gyanendra Pandey and David Hardiman. Gyanendra Pandey has looked at peasant movement in Faizabad district and history of Congress politics in Uttar Pradesh, and there, by looking at this peasant movement, particularly from Faizabad district in the context of non-cooperation movement, here in Faizabad the movement was led by a local leader called Baba Ramchandra, and Gyanan Pandey has argued that the terms and conditions, the aspirations for which peasants participated in this movement was entirely different from what Gandhi was preaching and advocating. Similarly, David Hardiman, in his study of peasant mobilization in Khera district of Gujarat, has shown similar disjunctures between the Congress politics at higher level and the ground realities, peasants' aspirations and their ways of entering into this politics. In his another study on tribal movement from South Gujarat region, again from 1920s, Hardiman demonstrates the coming together of local beliefs and nationalist politics, in which Gandhi was imagined and people followed Gandhi's directions, orders in their own terms, and in that milieu the stories were afloat that Mahatma Gandhi was sitting together with local goddess, thereby people must follow Mahatma Gandhi. So, this kind of sanctioning of political messages by local religious practices enables us to look at the relation between religion and politics in quite new ways, where both the domains set their rigidities. We come across a field where these categories appear quite porous. In all these studies, and I am merely mentioning few examples here. As our time does not permit to go into each and every contributions, but in all these studies close attention was paid to local dynamics, variations, specificities, local sources and regional archives, instead of interpreting and analyzing the historical archive with pre-assumed frames and questions. This provides new understanding of the politics itself. एक थोड़ा ब्रेक. So, in the writings of subaltern studies, we come across fresh grounds to rethink not merely colonialism and anti-national movement, not merely colonialism and anti-colonial movements, but also the idea of the political itself. As I was just mentioning, the domain of political is deeply imbued with local fervors, local textures of religiosities, customs, beliefs, etc. And this new understanding of politics is conceptually quite different from the overarching Marxist understanding of politics and the framework of looking at Indian national movement. While we earlier briefly talked about history from below, in which Marxist social historians paid close attention to participation of peasantries and working class in history. Here the crucial difference is that subaltern historians are not merely detailing how subalterns, how peasants and workers entered into politics and political arena, but how they entered into this political arena in their own terms. So, the emphasis is upon giving agency to these segments of society rather than treating them as mere participants, mere followers. Now, let us pay slightly more attention to this fact because it is crucial. In Western European context, historian Hobsbawm has also looked at phenomena of social banditry, where he argued that the bandits had pre-political consciousness. Now, Ranjit Guha contested that category and argues that in the perspective coming from history from below scholarship, or when Hobsbawm is treating social bandits as pre-political, his vantage point remains fixated to the concept of political thrown before us from the traditions of bourgeois parliamentary democracy. Anything outside that frame, outside this arena of bourgeois parliamentary democracy, is considered as pre-political, as in the imaginary time ladder something which will gradually mature into the full blown political. This leaves out the political experiences and aspirational dynamics, the way a large section of society articulates their political position and voices, and in that sense the notion of political coming from the Marxist perspective and frames is extremely limited. He offers, for example, a very interesting example. He offers a very interesting and thought provoking example in this regard. While reading documents, colonial archive against the grain related to Santhal rebellion of 1855-56, when tribals in now Jharkhand region revolted against British and were led by Sidhu and Kanu. They perceived their leaders as God has descended into their leaders' bodies. They believed that now, because Thakur, the God, has given blessings, has entered into the bodies, into bodies of these leaders, they need not fear anything. The bullets will become ineffective and they will defeat British. The leaders were captured by British authorities. The revolt was a failure. The revolt did not materialize. The leaders were captured, but how should we look at this phenomena? should we merely discard them as superstitious? That is the way British officials, and that is the way rational scientific discourse of history has always treated them. But is that the only way? Ranajit Guha and later in that debate Deepesh Chakrabarty encourages us to go beyond that stale frame of looking at political, and encourages us to appreciate different concepts of the political which we need to recognize instead of judging them from a fixed normative understanding of politics. This also leads us to an inherent anomaly between belief practices, religiosities, language of faith, which these actors show before us when they are entering into politics, and the rational scientific language in which history takes account of their activities and their understanding of politics. How to analyze these acts of faith in the language of science, which determines the history writing as a discipline. Another crucial factor, a methodological challenge that they pushes us, is how to write history of those who cannot write themselves, how to write about aspirations in life of people who are unlettered. This opens up new ways of looking at colonial archive against the grain for its own absences and for its own lack. We end this lecture here, and we will continue the thread when we will look at other recent interventions in the field of history writing. Thank you.